Winston Churchill, hero or villain?
Our next guest says President Trump can win a cyber war by following Winston Churchill's footsteps.
On behalf of Good Morning Britain and ITV, we would like to present you with a Churchill hat.
If you want an example of real racism, you just have to look to Churchill.
I'm going to cut right to the chase. He was an evil, racist man who brought about the death of millions of Indians.
I love Winston Churchill. Love the guy.
Churchill as a young man, exemplified here by this magnificent new bar at the Hyatt Regency London, was...
Boris, a journalist, before he's mayor of London and before he's foreign secretary, wrote a really fantastic book for a modern audience on Churchill.
There she is, one of the most beautiful women in London, giving birth here in Blenheim to Winston Churchill.
For what kind of country re-celebrates a funeral?
I know why most people think of him as a hero, because they know absolutely nothing about huge aspects of his legacy.
Ah, yes!
This Churchill we know. Resolute, inspirational,
And fictitious. Or at least mythologised to the point of fiction. Well, it seems to us here at elections generally that if the country is going to be run by a second-rate Churchill Tribute Act, we should at the very least know who the real Churchill actually was. That is, the man, not the myth. Right. Alex, take us to the desk. It's time to alienate.
Episode 4. Is this the Churchill you want to die on?
It's 1931, and... Wait a second. How did this dross get here? Our sincere apologies. It's 1931. An unemployed mechanic from Yonkers is driving down 5th Avenue. On the other side of the road, a taxi is stopped to let out its 58-year-old English passenger. But this Englishman has forgotten that Americans drive on the wrong side of the road. He steps out on the left-hand side without looking for oncoming traffic. The mechanic hits the Englishman, cracking 2 ribs, injuring his head, and sending him to the hospital. That passenger? Albert and Winston Churchill. Thankfully, and faithfully, Churchill's injuries weren't all that serious, and he was soon back on his feet again, bearing the driver no ill will. But had the car killed Churchill in 1931, he already would have had a bigger and more controversial career than most MPs could ever dream of. He'd already been a soldier, a journalist, a Conservative turncoat, Home Secretary, First Lord of the Admiralty, disgraced war leader, a Liberal turncoat, and Chancellor of the Exchequer during the biggest strike in Britain's history. And to think, it all started in a cosy little cottage called Blenheim Palace. Why don't you tell us about it, Alex? Alex, what are you doing?
I'm preparing for the inevitable flame war.
Ah, come on. He's being alarmist. There won't be another flame war in our generation.
I warn you, our enemies are already making their diabolical preparations in the comment sections. And in the seas.
Stuff and nonsense. Now we just tell them about Churchill's childhood.
Fine, but I'm going to keep on sandbagging.
Is that a halo thing?
Part 1. Early career. Escaping boredom. Churchill was born in 1874 in Blenheim Palace, his family's ancestral home. His father was Lord Randolph Churchill, a former Conservative Chancellor of the Exchequer and Secretary of State for India. Lord Randolph's career was inspirational for Winston, but he was personally a distant and uncaring father, who was at his most uncaring when he callously died while Winston was only 20. Slightly more affectionate was Jenny, Winston's mother, a New York socialite who gave her son his love of America. After leaving Harrow and attending Sandhurst, young Winston, determined to see action and colour himself in glory, used his mother's connections to get postings in Cuba, India and Sudan. Proper action came later, after the outbreak of the Second Boer War in modern-day South Africa.
After war broke out, Winston travelled to South Africa to be a war correspondent, but got mixed up in the fighting, becoming a prisoner of war, escaping, and eventually helping a British cavalry regiment drive the enemy out of town. In his reports back to Britain, Churchill wrote of his story as a ripping yarn, with himself as the hero. The Victorian readers at home loved it, and, still in his 20s, Winston had become a war hero and minor celebrity. Capitalising on his fame, Churchill returned home and was elected a Conservative MP, just like his daddy before him. But in Parliament, young Winston proved a poor Tory, constantly criticising the ruling Conservative government from the backbenches. His criticism of Conservative leaders was partly genuine and partly an attempt to get noticed. But as he would never quite learn, not all attention is good attention.
Hypocrite.
All his criticism really succeeded in doing was alienating himself from the Conservative leadership. That said, he did endear himself to the Liberals, the Conservatives' main political opponents. This all came to a head in 1904 when he crossed the floor to sit with the Liberals. Now, far be it from us to suggest he only did this to further his own political ambition.
Though he totally did.
But he certainly picked a good time to have a crisis of conscience. From 1906, the Liberals would be in power one way or the other for the next 15 years, and Churchill would be in the cabinet for most of it. That means there's a lot to cover, so let's get stuck in. And apologies if we leave out your favourite bit.
Part 2. Winston Churchill, Liberal Snowflake.
Churchill's first big job was Under Secretary of State for the Colonies. Coincidentally, the most British-sounding job title in history. Even early in his career, Churchill was a committed imperialist, though he considered himself to be a generous one. In practice, this meant that he was often willing to grant the requests of people living in British territories, but only on the condition that they never questioned Britain's absolute right to govern. In this spirit, with British domination of South Africa having been secured militarily in the Boer War, Churchill oversaw reforms intended to equalise the rights of British settlers and the Boers, whilst also overseeing laws intended to phase out the indentured servitude of Chinese people. Not so bad, Churchill. On the other hand, these liberalising reforms did not extend to black people in South Africa, and some have seen the exclusion of black people at this time as sowing the seeds of the future apartheid regime. Nice one, Winston. He also used the position to secure some absolute lads-on-tour trips around the world, becoming the only Prime Minister to get sloshed on 4 different continents. Within a few years, he was promoted to become President of the Board of Trade, now a mostly ceremonial title, but back then a big cheese position critical to running Britain's economy. As President of the Board of Trade, Churchill was the political sidekick to radical Liberal Chancellor David Lloyd George, who at that time was trying to push the People's Budget through a right-wing and aristocratic House of Lords. The People's Budget would tax Britain's wealthy in order to fund new social welfare programmes, like unemployment insurance, an old age pension, and caps on working hours.
But wait a second, we're still talking about the Sir Winston Spencer Churchill, aren't we? The aristocrat who hated socialism with every fibre of his champagne-soaked being?
Oh, hey there, straw man! Yeah, that's right. Incongruous as it seems, old right-wing Churchill spent his early 30s helping Lloyd George pass what many view to be the beginnings of Britain's welfare state.
But why?
It's an interesting question, with different answers depending on who you ask. First, the young Winston seems to have had some genuine sympathy for the plight of the working classes, saying in 1909,
"If we stand on the old happy-go-lucky way, with the richer classes ever growing in wealth and in number, and ever declining in responsibility, the very poor remaining plunging ever deeper in their helpless misery, then I think there is nothing before us but savage strife between class and class."
Sure, we're all more left-wing when we're younger. But he wasn't just being altruistic. All his life he was a hard-line anti-socialist. But he believed socialism could only be prevented by the upper class accepting responsibility for the welfare of the poor. Ultimately, his view of Britain's working class was similar to his view of its empire. He would be kind and generous, provided the upper class was never fundamentally challenged. In the Liberal Party, he saw a vehicle for the ruling class to be beneficent, while still maintaining the basic structure of the class system. Or as he would have put it,
the integrity of the individual.
This view, sometimes known as One Nation conservatism, eventually became the Tory mainstream, practiced by all these people. But it ended with Thatcher. And we'll get there. I'm going to need a bigger fort.
Lastly, throughout his life, Churchill loved action. This was as much true in politics as in war. In his own words,
Hulk smash!
Oh wait, sorry, wrong quote. There we go.
"Politics are almost as exciting as war, and quite as dangerous. In war you could only be killed once. In politics, many times."
His joy was finding fights and getting stuck in. And at the turn of the century, the biggest political brawler in town was David Lloyd George. So it's only natural that they would gravitate towards each other. His biggest help in passing the People's Budget was conveying to his fellow aristocrats in the House of Lords that if they kept resisting, the Liberals would just pack their chamber till it broke. This threat was enough to get the budget passed and earned Churchill a progressive reputation. It was also around this time that he married his beloved and long-suffering Clemmie, a suffragist, who would act as a moderating influence on Churchill's sterner impulses. For his role in helping pass the budget, Churchill was promoted to the Home Office, where he would quickly lose his progressive reputation. Now, in fairness to Churchill, he did continue some liberalising reforms as Home Secretary. helping to de-Victorianise the Edwardian hellhole prisons, and reducing the number of crimes that could get you hanged. Yet, it was also as Home Secretary that his love of fights and action would be turned to less progressive ends. First was his reaction to the suffragettes. Though a modest supporter of giving women the right to vote, provided these women weren't too working class to vote for the Conservatives or the Liberals, Churchill was most remembered by the suffragettes for being Home Secretary on Black Friday, a suffragette march on Parliament that was suppressed by police brutality, including sexual assault. Many suffragettes believed that Churchill had ordered this heavy-handed response personally, though he vigorously denied this, and prevented any suffragettes from being prosecuted as a result of the march. Yet, he also prevented an inquiry being held into police misconduct, making himself an enemy of the suffragette movement and leaving a controversial legacy. More controversial still was his willingness to use the army against strikers, first in South Wales during the Tonypandy riots, and then again in Liverpool during the General Transport Strike. In Liverpool, troops dispatched by Churchill opened fire into the crowd, killing 2 and wounding a further 15. Churchill defenders claim that he only ever used the army as a last resort to restore order, but in South Wales, in Liverpool and across the Labour movement, Churchill was viewed as an aristocrat with blood on his hands. None of this was particularly helped by the so-called Siege of Sydney Street in East London, where Churchill went personally to the scene of a shootout between the police, the army and an armed gang of revolutionaries. Pathé News captured footage of the event that still exists, but we can't show you because Pathé are harsh as hell when it comes to copyright strikes and charge about £1 million to use any of their clips. However, when contemporaries saw the footage, no one was quite sure why the Home Secretary felt the need to bring his top hat and tails there personally. In truth, he'd gone there for the fun of it, and for the publicity, traits that didn't seem altogether becoming in a Home Secretary, especially given his willingness to use the army against civilians. So you won't be surprised to learn that he wasn't Home Secretary very long, and they soon moved him sideways to become First Lord of the Admiralty, essentially the politician in charge of Britain's navy. As First Lord of the Admiralty, he impacted the course of World War I in a number of different ways. He modernised the British fleet before the war, he was one of the first politicians to grasp the military importance of aircraft, and is sometimes credited as the Steve Jobs behind the tank. Yet unfortunately, he was also at the very least the Bill Gates behind using mustard gas in entrenched positions. For all that though, the contribution to World War I that would haunt him the longest is undoubtedly the Gallipoli campaign. By 1915, the Western Front was a stalemate. Trusting his own sense of grand strategy, Churchill believed securing the Dardanelles in modern-day Turkey would open a supply line to Russia and create a third front that would split German forces. However, an initial naval assault was frustrated by enemy artillery and mines, poor weather, and the British Navy's comparatively obsolete ships in the Mediterranean. Despite these early setbacks, the land invasion went ahead, mostly using Indian troops and Anzac soldiers from Australia and New Zealand. It was a disaster. The battle quickly became just as entrenched as the Western Front. After 8 months and over 300,000 casualties, the Allies were forced to withdraw. Many Australians and New Zealanders felt they'd been used as cannon fodder by a mother country who didn't value their lives as much as soldiers from the British Isles.
The Indian soldiers felt the same, but were less surprised.
However you cut it, it was a military catastrophe, and the blame was attributed to Churchill's overconfidence in his own iconoclastic vision and his failure to listen to military experts. When the Liberals formed a wartime coalition government with the Conservatives, Churchill's removal from the Admiralty was a key Tory condition. Shamed by the defeats and the deaths, Churchill resigned from cabinet completely and went to command a small battalion on the Western Front. He was a lenient and popular commander who genuinely enjoyed walks in no man's land, though he couldn't resist politics long, and after 6 months he requested a discharge to return to Westminster, which he got, mostly because the army thought having a sitting MP in the trenches was insane to begin with. When his old ally Lloyd George became Prime Minister, Churchill was quickly brought back into the fold, becoming Minister of Munitions in 1917, and when the war had ended in 1918, being promoted to Secretary of State for War and the Air. Now, if we're looking for reasons to stand Churchill, his opposition to punishing Germany after World War I was, in retrospect, far-sighted and really should have been listened to. But if we're looking for reasons to anti-stand Churchill, well, I'm afraid we'll have to talk about Ireland.
Must we? I don't want to open up another front in the Flame War before I fully fortified the first.
Ugh, you worry too much. When has Irish history ever caused a row? Now get back to your barricade, you filthy prod.
Hey, I'm only a little Protestant.
Before the war broke out in 1914, as a cabinet minister, Churchill had been deeply involved in the so-called Ulster question, the issue of northern Protestants not wanting to be part of Irish Home Rule, and also coincidentally the name of Alex and I's new wave musical side hustle. Alternative Ulster, grab it, take it at yours. But over the course of the war, the situation in Ireland had fundamentally changed. Calls for home rule had been replaced by demands for full independence, and the IRA was running a guerrilla/terror campaign intended to make British rule in Ireland impossible. As Secretary of State for War, Churchill's contribution to all this was the so-called Black and Tans, a government paramilitary force composed mostly of World War I veterans and dressed in surplus khaki uniforms, hence the name. Viewers familiar with the Black and Tans will know that they need to come out and fight me like a man and show their wives how they won medals down in Flanders. Viewers unfamiliar with them need only know that they were hated in Ireland for a campaign of reprisals they took against the IRA that targeted innocent civilians. When informed of atrocities committed by the Black and Tans, Churchill nevertheless stood by their deployment, earning himself the hatred of many in Ireland, a hatred that persists to this day and was partly responsible for Irish neutrality during World War II. And that's not even to get into what he got up to in the Middle East at the time, where he wanted to use mustard gas on Kurdish rebels in Iraq. At the very least, I think it's fair to say that by the 1920s, over a decade in power had gone to Churchill's head. Nothing illustrates this better than the utterly bonkers Chanak crisis, another Churchillian disaster in Turkey. After the end of World War I, Greece had been given parts of western Turkey to occupy. But the Turks weren't having it, and they quickly drove the Greeks out. Lloyd George and Churchill were furious, and they wanted to retaliate by declaring war on Turkey, fostering a grand ambition to reclaim Constantinople for Christendom. Think about it. It's only 4 years after the end of World War I, and Churchill wants to start another war to satisfy his own sense of personal destiny. He even went so far as to draft a communique stating that the Dominions, namely Canada, Australia and New Zealand, were ready to fight on Britain's side, which they very much weren't. In fact, and ironically given how big of an imperialist he was, the whole fiasco hastened the Dominions' attempts to seek control over their own foreign policy, and mad shouts for one Canadian viewer. The Tories propping up Lloyd George's coalition were having none of it, and quickly collapsed the government. In the election that followed, Churchill suffered an appendicitis, and quickly lost his seat to a Scottish prohibitionist, who for some reason was in much better health. In his own words, Churchill was left without an office, without a seat, and without an appendix. With his adopted political party sliding into obsolescence, and the new Conservative leadership distrusting him for his many, many blunders, surely Churchill's career was over. Well, obviously it was.
Part 3. Conservative Frontbencher.
In hindsight, it appears inevitable that Labour would replace the Liberals as the main party of the left in British politics. Though for more detail on how this actually happened, see our video here. But most politicians are a little sentimentally attached to the parties they spent their lives working for, and so few Liberals could bring themselves to accept this. Not so Winston Churchill, who mainly viewed political parties as vehicles for his own personal ambition. This let him twig early that the Liberals were on the way out and would leave the Conservatives as the main anti-socialist party in Britain. 20 years after betraying the Tories, he needed to find a way home to his father's old party. Luckily for him, and he was often lucky, elections in the 1920s came about as frequently as buses, giving him lots of opportunity to use his undeniable rhetorical skills to brandish his anti-socialist credentials. It worked, and when the Labour government fell in 1924, Churchill was given a free run at the Conservative safe seat in Epping, with the gentleman's agreement that once elected, he would join the Tories again properly. The Conservatives won that election, though still lost many votes to the Liberals. The new Prime Minister, Stanley Baldwin, hoped to win more old Liberal votes by making Winston Churchill Chancellor of the Exchequer, his father's old job. Churchill was reportedly thrilled, saying, "I still have my father's robes." Churchill is often characterised as being poor at playing the game of politics. But the fact that he was able to successfully change parties twice surely suggests that he had some skill.
Or it shows you can get away with literally anything if you're posh enough. You decide.
Either way, Churchill's biggest decision as Chancellor was reintroducing the gold standard, which we've covered in more detail here. But the short version is, it didn't work, and it made British goods too expensive to export. The resulting fall in living standards and rise in industrial strife produced the 1926 General Strike, still the biggest piece of industrial action in British history. Surprise, surprise, Churchill suggested that the army be used to break the strikes, reportedly saying in Cabinet, "A little bloodletting wouldn't hurt." Thankfully, cooler heads prevailed, and the general strike ended without much bloodshed. Churchill would stay as Chancellor for the rest of the Conservatives' term in office, but with his feet now planted firmly on the right of the party. A long journey from the young radical liberal.
Part 4. The Wilderness Years.
The Churchill myth, see these films for more, begins with Churchill as Cassandra, the prophet who saw war coming but no one would listen to.
We've heard it all before.
This is partly true, but it raises its own interesting question. If Churchill was so right and so charismatic, why couldn't he convince more people of the threat Hitler posed? You know, earlier, when the war would have been easier to win. I'm afraid, to answer that question, we're going to have to talk about India, and things are going to get problematic.
That's it, I'm out. Oh yeah.
In 1929, the Conservatives were kicked out of office and were replaced by the second Labour government. In opposition, Churchill remained a frontbencher, but not for long. Soon after taking power, the Labour government announced its support for giving India Dominion status, a sort of limited devolution that would set India on the road to the autonomy of Canada, Australia or New Zealand. Now, Churchill expected this kind of irresponsible behaviour from the intemperate socialist regrettably given power by an intemperate public. But what really got his goat was the fact that Conservative leader Stanley Baldwin also supported the move. As an imperialist, Churchill knew that Britain's global power hinged on its control of India, and feared losing that control would render Britain a mid-tier nation. But not even Churchill would be that honest about the realpolitik behind empire. Instead, he embraced the racist notion that Indians were incapable of self-government and required British instruction on how to run their own country. He also indulged in centuries-old tactics of divide and rule by arguing that the Hindu majority would inevitably oppress the Muslim minority and other religious minorities in the case of independence, whilst of course enlightened Britain would ensure all faiths were treated with fairness and harmony. And that argument didn't take. Churchill then argued that an independent India would result in such reduced food imports to Britain that a third of the British population would starve. He called for the Indian National Congress to be broken up and its leaders deported, and in 1930 said that
Gandhiism and all it represents shall have to be grappled with and crushed.
And there's more Gandhi hatred where that came from. When Gandhi met with the British Viceroy in India, Churchill infamously said,
"It is alarming and also nauseating to see Mr. Gandhi, a seditious middle-temper lawyer, now posing as a fucker of a type well known in the East, striding half-naked up the steps of the Viceregal Palace to parley in equal terms with a representative of the King Emperor."
Come on, it was the olden times. Everyone thought like that.
Actually, Strawman, I'm afraid you're demonstrating a degree of historical illiteracy.
Well, duh. Only read classics.
And it shows. Because by 1930, most mainstream British politicians had accepted that increasing Indian autonomy was inevitable, hence the cross-party support for Dominion status. But Churchill couldn't wear it. He resigned the front bench in protest.
Oh. Some historians say this was really about Churchill priming a leadership challenge against Baldwin from the right, but if so, it never materialised, and he never reneged his opposition to Indian independence, or his massive racism against Indians.
Churchill's grim proclamations about Gandhi, Indian independence, and socialists in Britain made him sound like a crank. And it meant that when he made similarly grave proclamations about Hitler and the danger of the Nazis, it was all too easy for MPs to dismiss him as a long-time stirrer looking for something new to stir about. And this wasn't exactly helped by his reputation of enjoying fights just for the sake of it. This is why in the 1930s Churchill was viewed as a warmongerer, because of all the warmongering he'd done in the 1920s. When Stanley Baldwin formed a national government, Churchill remained on the backbenches. A voice of hard-right Tory opinion, but otherwise politically isolated. His lowest ebb was in 1936, during the abdication crisis, which we'll be able to explain using the one piece of Pathé news footage that we've cleared for upload.
And so, by the power vested in me...
What do you see?
Oh no! He wants to marry an American! Nazi-sympathising divorcee!
Oh, for the love of Pete!
Stanley Baldwin?
Oh, now what does he want?
Spoiler alert, the king still married her, but he had to abdicate first. For our purposes, the important thing is that Churchill took the monarch's side over the elected Prime Minister, feeling that the King Emperor should be able to marry whoever he wishes,
Rumours abounded that Churchill was once again going to break for the Conservatives, this time to find a new King's Party in Parliament that would seek to bring down the government. These rumours turned out to be unfounded, but nevertheless they severely damaged Churchill's reputation.
Of course, he did a lot of paintings in the 30s, so silver linings.
So tarnished was Churchill that even other anti-appeasement Conservatives wanted nothing to do with him, lest they be tarred with the same brush. But whatever you might say about him on other things, on Hitler, he was right.
Part 5. Churchill and the War.
In September 1938, Stanley Baldwin's successor, Neville Chamberlain, descended the steps of his plane holding a piece of paper proclaiming peace in our time. This piece of paper was the Munich Agreement, and it offered Hitler control of the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia in exchange for not invading the rest of Czechoslovakia. Churchill called the deal
a complete surrender of the Western democracies to the Nazi threat of force,
and thought Chamberlain a fool to trust Hitler. 6 months later, in March 1939, Hitler invaded the rest of Czechoslovakia, and the Allies didn't stand up to him. Convinced they would never stand up to him, on the 1st of December 1939, Hitler ordered the invasion of Poland. And you know the rest. Within 12 hours, Churchill had been invited to join Britain's new war cabinet as First Lord of the Admiralty. On entering his old office, his first order was to re-hang the 1914 map of Europe that he'd strategised over in World War I. He'd been proven right on the most important issue of his life, and his reputation was quickly rehabilitated. But he wasn't Prime Minister yet. Neville Chamberlain was still in power. What ousted Chamberlain wasn't the outbreak of war in 1939, but the prosecution of it in 1940, all culminating in the so-called Norwegian crisis. Prior to the Norwegian crisis, Churchill, fearing valuable Scandinavian iron ore falling into German control, had advocated that Norwegian neutrality be ignored and their waters mined with sea mines that would slow down any potential German invasion. Chamberlain thought that breaching a country's neutrality like that was too big a risk, and he vetoed the plan. And, you've already guessed it, in April 1940, Germany did invade and quickly occupied the entirety of Norway. Chamberlain's caution had cost the Allies vital resources and handed Germany a critical position in the Atlantic. It was clear that the war needed a leader who wanted to fight, and the peaceable Chamberlain was not that leader. In the House of Commons, MPs lambasted the government's handling of the war, though spared Churchill the worst of the criticism. Whilst Chamberlain survived a motion of no confidence, he realised that, just as in World War I, the war would require a cross-party coalition of all parties in the Commons. But Labour refused to serve under him as Prime Minister, and needed a new Prime Minister before they would enter a coalition. Soundings were taken, and the two candidates that emerged were Winston Churchill and formerly pro-appeasement Foreign Secretary Lord Halifax.
Maybe I'm a banker who's completely obsessed. Got a little something that's bound to impress. This current account pays a higher amount of extraordinary interest. Now you probably think it's all too tough to change those debits and credits to be rearranged. Just give me the signal and without any fuss, you can leave the whole thing to us. Extra, extra, I know you want more. I'll give you something extra when you walk through my door. Extra, extra, though I cannot deny. Terms and conditions apply.
It's easy to change to the current account that pays an extraordinary 4% interest. Halifax, always giving you extra.
No, not that Lord Halifax. This one. But Halifax was a member of the House of Lords and believed that the PM had to be an MP. This left Churchill the only remaining candidate, and he spoke to the nation, pledging it nothing but his blood, toil, tears and sweat.
All of which would have been about 20% proof. Cheers!
Now came Churchill's key contribution to British history, and the reason many view him as England's greatest hero. After a few days of his taking power, France fell to the German advance, and the new national government was faced with its first and arguably biggest decision. Should it seek a negotiated peace, or continue fighting until the bitter end? Militarily, the situation appeared dire, if not hopeless. The whole world was stunned at how quickly France had fallen, and British troops were still stranded on the beaches of Dunkirk. Many Conservatives felt the war had already been lost, and that to go on fighting would only cause pointless suffering. Chief among these was Lord Halifax himself, still Foreign Secretary, who wanted to use the still neutral Mussolini to seek negotiated peace terms. Churchill, while Prime Minister, still lacked a strong base of support in the Conservative Party, and so couldn't just fire Halifax without risking the collapse of his government. But from the outset, he was committed to
victory. Victory at all costs. Victory in spite of all terror. Victory however long and hard the road may be. For without victory, there is no survival.
He liked victory, is the point.
Churchill's conception of Britain as a great and glorious nation made it impossible for him to accept any form of surrender. Seeking to outmaneuver Halifax, Churchill convened a meeting of his entire cabinet, not just the War Cabinet. And here, it really does seem like it was his faith in Britain's ability to win against the apparent odds that rallied his ministers and caused them to vote against any form of negotiated peace. Britain's refusal to surrender after the fall of France bought the world time and was critical in ensuring the Allies were eventually able to defeat Hitler. Had someone else got the job, this might have turned out differently, and the history of the world would have been unimaginably darker.
That's a nice point to end it on. We are ending it there, aren't we?
I'm afraid not, because we've yet to touch on the most toxic aspect of Churchill's legacy.
Oh boy.
While few reasonable people take issue with Churchill's conduct in 1940, when he led the country through the Battle of Britain and strove always to bring America into the Allies, Churchill critics do take issue with his later prosecution of the war, particularly the widespread bombing of German cities and the massive Indian casualties this caused. For our part, we simply lack the military expertise to know whether this was justified as a means of bringing the war to a quicker end. Something we're also unqualified to talk about is the Bengal famine of 1943, but we think any review of Churchill's career would be incomplete without discussion of the famine, so we're going to try our best, and you'll appreciate if we dispense with the gags while we do so. While it can be convincingly argued that it was the conditions of empire that made Bengal susceptible to famine, the trigger in 1943 was the fall of British-controlled Burma/Myanmar to Japanese forces. This cut off vital food imports to India and prompted a scorched earth response from the British authorities in Bengal, who feared the territory falling to enemy hands. The result was food shortages, food hoarding, and, very quickly, starvation. When Churchill was warned of the starvation in India, he doodled in the margins of his report, "Why hasn't Gandhi died yet?" And when pressed to divert shipping to help alleviate the suffering, said in a social Darwinistic fashion that more food wouldn't help because the root cause was Indians breeding like rabbits. Churchill maintained that there was enough food in other Indian provinces to help Bengal, but continued with the policy of exporting food from India to increase already well-provisioned stockpiles in Europe. Churchill's defenders state that his shocking statements at the time were driven by the stress of overseeing the British war effort and didn't reflect his actual policy, which was to eventually tolerate some food being diverted from Canada and Australia and to seek food aid from America. They also seek to distinguish the unintended famine from the pre-planned murder, ethnic cleansings and genocides of the likes of Hitler. But what is clear is that Churchill's racism did influence his government's response to the crisis, that it caused him to ignore warnings, and that he viewed Bengali lives in particular as more expendable than others, perhaps even inconsequential. This racism contributed to the deaths of millions. While this may not be exactly the same as the genocides carried out by the fascist and communist regimes of the day, if it was you or someone you loved dying as a result of it, it's difficult to imagine that distinction carrying very much weight. Adding further insult, after the war, Churchill would claim that India had been spared the worst of the conflict and carried to victory on the shoulders of a much smaller island. Of course, racism was the default for British politicians at the time, but the extent of Churchill's prejudice shocked even his contemporaries. Consider the words of his own Secretary of State for India and fellow schoolmate at Harrow, Leo Amery, who said during one fraught cabinet exchange that he could see very little difference between Churchill's view of Indians and Hitler's view of the Jews. That's his own Secretary of State for India, for goodness sake. Even Churchill himself would, in the last years of his life, express some vague regrets over his policy towards India, though he never went into specifics. So we've reached the crux of it. Churchill was vital, perhaps essential in defeating the Nazis, and compared to them, he's definitely a goodie. But that's about as low a bar as it's possible to imagine,
And much of his legacy beyond that is shocking. With all that in mind, is it okay that Britain still views Churchill as a hero? Well... Go for the simple reductive take, Michael. That's what the algorithm demands. No, strive for nuance. Serve a higher purpose, even at the cost of like, shares and subscribes. Nuance, you say?
Nuance? Come off it. Do you want to be complicit in writing out subjugated peoples from the historical narrative, all to satisfy the nationalist myths of post-imperial Britain? Here's your nuance. Without Churchill, you'd be doing this video in German.
Or Irish. I don't know what to say.
Hey, Michael. You good?
Oh, yeah.
Wrap it up.
Okay, in the end, you'll have to make up your own mind. But what we will say is this. It's perfectly fine to admire Churchill's stand during the war, or to feel grateful for everything he did to defeat fascism. But these feelings mustn't let us ever forget the real people who suffered and died as a result of his failings, whether they be in India, Ireland, Britain itself, or Kenya, which we'll discuss in a later episode. Not only because forgetting these people is wrong in itself, but because only remembering the heroic aspects of Churchill paints a false image of Britain's past and gives you a false idea of where the country stands today. Better yet would be to stand back and cease looking for superheroic role models in history, and instead try simply to learn the lessons that it teaches us about humanity as a whole.
This is some very weak tea, Michael. If that's all you were building up to, why even have a dedicated Churchill video?
Because for too long, those lessons haven't been learned. In fact, they've been actively avoided. Which brings us to...
Part 6. Churchill and the Culture War.
It's really since his death in 1965 that Churchill has been transformed from a real politician into a cartoony embodiment of Britain and Britishness. The ideology that motivated Churchill died with the Empire, and so he's been turned into a temperament, or a posture, or a tone of voice for politicians to drop into when they need instant gravitas. Countless politicians, not just Conservatives but across parties, live in hope of their own Churchillian moment, where their unique stubbornness and determination will see Britain through a crisis and themselves into the history books. And look, you know what? We get it. This shield isn't just a nice piece of set dressing that we picked up in a souvenir shop. It was a leaving gift given to my grandfather's aunt for the work she did in the Cabinet Office during the war. Now, because of that pesky Official Secrets Act, there's only so much Auntie Ning could ever tell us about what she actually did. But when we did tell her story, the fact that she worked so closely under Churchill personally is one of the first things we say. But history requires clear-headed honesty. And, as I hope we've demonstrated, Churchill's uniqueness might have been vital in 1940, but it was basically useless the rest of the time. That means that the politicians who live in hope of a repeat of 1940 have learnt all the wrong lessons from his long career. Instead, so great is the need to emulate Churchill that existential threats are invented just to justify playing his old tunes.
Now, who on earth could you be talking about?
While I'm on my soapbox, let me also caution you against the disingenuousness of those who say we should celebrate Churchill's successes and learn from his failures and then never learn from his failures. Because Churchill's worst failures were the result of a life of privilege that gave him precious little insight into the lives of people he felt born to rule. And, unlike the man himself, that network of wealth and privilege is still alive and well today. So, how do we do, Alex? Still worried about that flame war?
It's interesting. I think you've equivocated so much you'll have angered basically everyone.
No matter. We shall fight them in the comments. We shall fight them in the DMs and on Twitter. We shall fight them in the accompanying podcast. We will defend our crappy show. And should this channel live to 1,000 subscribers, men will still say this was their finest half hour.
Actually, we're well over.
Bugger.
Please like and subscribe. It's 37 degrees.
He's fine.